Hello, and welcome to the AWS Research IT Training Series. I'm Jack Fenwick, your host for today's webinar and Strategic Alliances Manager for the dedicated AWS research team. Today, we are delighted to have two presenters here to discuss Beyond Tech, building a regulated data program for higher ed research. Our first presenter is Bill Bonner, Director of Network and Cloud Engineering at Washington State University. As noted here, Bill has spent 20 years supporting instructional research and enterprise computing within higher education. Bill collaborates with faculty and staff at Washington State University to build central services to solve real-world problems, including initiatives for regulatory compliance, cloud research enclaves, and statewide networking to establish WSU as a university system. Also joining us today is Dr. Scott Friedman, Principal Technical Business Development Manager on the AWS research team. Scott focuses on articulating how universities and their researchers can leverage powerful AWS capabilities for research workloads. Prior to joining AWS, Scott was the Chief Technologist for Advanced Research Computing at UCLA, managing all aspects of research enablement through advanced computing, storage, and networking resources. We will reserve the last 5 to 10 minutes of the session today for Q&A. Please feel free to place any questions that you may have during the presentation in the questions queue in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will read them aloud at the end of today's session. With that, I'll pass the microphone over to Scott to start us off. So Scott, please take it away.
Thank you, Jack. Hello, everybody, and welcome. As Jack said, I'm Scott Friedman. I'm a member of the higher ed research team here at AWS, and today's webinar is about secure enclaves, secure computing, and building an environment that supports that kind of thing. This is something that anyone in higher education research or manages higher education research is going to be aware of and have a need for. And we thought we'd have Bill come on and talk about the really interesting work that he's done and built at Washington State. I think there's a lot of valuable lessons he can share, particularly for schools that are either looking to expand their capabilities in this regard, or probably more commonly, schools that are looking to go down this road in the first place. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and I'll be here to, probably pepper him with a few questions along the way, but we want to, as Jack said, leave some time at the end to answer your questions. So Bill, welcome, and take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Scott, for the introduction, Jack, as well. Pleasure to be here, and hopefully I can help share some interesting information for folks out there. So really, to get started, I think everybody in the higher ed landscape, like Scott mentioned, has gone through the experience on the research side of going through your standard procedures and practices for pursuing grant and funding opportunities, and then at one point or another you start getting blindsided by these security requirements that are either new or now being enforced in different ways on these awards. And that's very much the experience we had at WSU. And so this is really just a story about what we did at WSU to overcome those challenges and really take it as an opportunity to build a really good program here and a new set of services to support research. So, really this story is less on the technology side. I'm happy to answer questions that folks have on technology, but it's really about the outcomes we enabled by pivoting our secure data handling processes to AWS and the platforms and services we were able to build on top of that here at WSU. So Jack, could you go to the next slide here, I believe? So really what I want to do to motivate all of this, why should anybody out in the higher ed space care about what we did here? And I think what I'll do is just summarize, the before state and the after state of this program. And I won't just read you the slide here, but we were very much in a world where these regulations and these requirements were being sprung on researchers at the last moment. Or they were suddenly having their fundamental research exemptions for security requirements denied that had been maybe approved on longstanding partnerships for years and years and years, and they didn't know what to do about it. And so we had our researchers, our PIs were all of a sudden confused about what they could and could not pursue. They're being blindsided by costs, sometimes post-award when it's too late for them to try to enumerate them and write them into their grants. And our faculty were wasting a lot of their time chasing the bureaucratic processes because we didn't really have an official way of handling these problems here at WSU. And so the outcome of that, and Jack, if you could advance us to the next slide, sort of the after state of the program was that our faculty, by and large, don't need to worry about what the security requirements are on the grants they want to pursue or the research they want to pursue. We can accommodate almost anything that WSU researchers might want to pursue, and are exploring developing new lines of even more tightly regulated research here at WSU to build on top of our successes here. We are solving the problems of PIs being blindsided with unknown IT costs by providing rapid turnaround on costing, cost forecasts for out in the cloud. I know one of the big challenges that folks have out in the cloud is what is it going to cost me, and that discomfort with on-demand or consumption-based pricing, and so helping them overcome that hurdle, and then really providing them a single point of contact, and saying all this bureaucracy you've been going through isn't necessary. You can come work with us, and so on. So that's sort of the backdrop here. And Scott, did I miss anything there? Anything I should elaborate on before sort of diving in here?
I think this is a great setup for our discussion today, because I think these are exactly some of the issues that drive building a solution like this. And I think what's really going to be interesting for those who are listening is many times schools approach this with, say, a VDI environment. They build a Citrix or VMware environment, and you can have any kind of solution you want as long as it's a standard Windows VM, and you're going to have to put everything that you might want to do into that space. And I think what you've done shows that there could be a much more fulsome approach. And what I mean by fulsome is not only technically, but fulsome in terms of the way the university operates and culturally and all the rest. So that's the only thing I would want to add to what you said.
Yep, great. So just to start with the journey, in my prior role here at Washington State University, I was the director of IT for the College of Agricultural, Human and Natural Resource Sciences, and I'll refer to that as Connors. And we were already supporting a large number of regulated data research programs because of WSU Extension, data sharing agreements with the state. Our Department of Economics economists love data, so they want to get data from everyone who will give them data to analyze. And so we already had a bit of a program in place to support that. And around 2018 or so, when the universities, I think across the nation, started to really to become aware on the research side of things like DFARS and other requirements starting to be applied to any sort of federal award, and NIST 800-171 as a security control set that needed to be met potentially by universities that hadn't really thought about that historically. We started to be contacted by our Office of Research saying, this is on the roadmap, this is on the horizon, are you prepared for it? And we were saying, yeah, we can satisfy this. And we'd already been doing some work in AWS with VDI for our students across the state, but we hadn't really addressed this regulated data research need component yet. And so the first thing that came up, where we sort of became a pressure release valve for the institution, was a long-term 20-year longitudinal study with data that was suddenly in jeopardy because it couldn't comply with new data sharing requirements from the state of Washington. And the Office of Research reached out to us and said, can you help here? Because otherwise we can't sign off on this award. It was funded research, and obviously very important to the researchers, having spent many years on this program already. And we were able to, using AWS, quickly build sort of that first prototype of our regulated data environment and what's grown from that to the program that we have today. That was important in hindsight because it gave us a bit of a soft launch. We became that pressure release valve to solve problems. So, to really justify going to the cloud and doing something completely different for WSU or for institutions that don't have a large cloud practice yet, is we had a very specific need that needed to be satisfied, a very specific use case, really clear parameters. And we were able to go out and sort of soft launch that and prove that we can satisfy the need with AWS, prove that we can manage the cost and the security, and go through all those early audits, which were a great learning curve for us on entering the world of working with regulated data. When we went to really formalize that after I changed roles and came over to the central IT department for the WSU system, we really set about how can we take what we learned here with this sort of almost informal pressure release valve startup type and really make it a formal service for the institution at large, for faculty. And how can we make sure that we're going to satisfy everybody's needs? And that was a big challenge for us, working with Office of Research and our finance folks to really build this service sort of from the ground up. And it was a great exercise in reaching out to our customers, the faculty, and working with multiple stakeholders to build that service. And I think as we went through and we're building that, one of the big things we had to think about is what is the typical flow of business here at WSU? WSU, like many institutions probably, is very distributed. We have budgetarily, as well as just in general, our business processes are very distributed across the colleges and the other areas of the university and campuses. So we couldn't create some big monolithic central platform that all money and processes flow through. We had to utilize our existing processes. Fortunately, AWS is very flexible in that regard. We were able to get all the right pieces in place from procurement on down to implementation and security controls and user accounts and all of that, so that we're able to keep all of the finances and everything separate by area, the permissions and controls, and just the simple mechanics of receiving an invoice and paying an invoice being done by the right people in the organization without having to change our university structure. And so that was really important. That seems like really maybe an odd thing to talk about when you're talking about cloud computing and regulated data, but the learning curve for an institution to go to a consumption-based model and the procurement and the managing all the direct costs is really important, because those direct costs need to be kept with the grant that you're helping the researchers write those costs into. So that was a big challenge, and we didn't want to add a lot of service center overhead and things like that to it. So AWS is very flexible there. The other thing that we were able to do was really transition the mindset of our IT teams from delivering what I would say are traditional IT services to delivering an ecosystem that other folks can operate within. So I think, you think about how you build an IT service, and Scott had mentioned, virtual desktops and Citrix and VMware and so on. I think as IT people, we often think in terms of, well, I can buy some servers or some storage and make some file shares and give them to people, and that's how I build an IT service. And they need new permissions, they reach out to me, they need a virtual machine, I can provision that. And what we really did was pivot to how can we take AWS in its entirety and provide it as sort of cloud as a service here at WSU, so that all of the services from relational databases and big data and object stores and computing and containers and everything, machine learning, the full complement of everything that might be necessary, but also interesting for our researchers to learn and explore, would be available to them without having to go through an intermediary, right? That's the big theme here, is how are we able to keep the faculty really close to the technology that's driving their research program, because we knew we couldn't be a bottleneck. We couldn't introduce ourselves where a researcher gets a wild hair at 2 a.m. And wants to explore something and can't, because there's some form they have to fill out and wait for a ticket to percolate through. And then how do we balance that against security compliance and so on? And we're able to do that by identifying how we can deliver the AWS account and configure just those necessary security controls that create an envelope around the account itself and really deliver that to the faculty. And so that was a big learning curve for the IT teams, and think in terms of developing ecosystems that folks can operate within, as opposed to fully enumerated discrete IT services that are really closely married to the technology. So that's a lot of the thought processes that went into building this new service. Scott, did I sort of just talked on and on there? Did I miss anything in particular?
No, I think it was, you've given a good background on where you came from and where you went, where you're going, I would say. So please continue.
Okay. So once we had identified sort of the how, the first iteration of how we can really do this as a formal service, our next step was to actually go ahead and deliver it to the researcher community. And that required a couple of things. We needed to coordinate with our Office of Research to make sure that we were in line with their processes. So what that looked like mechanically here at WSU, and I think it's similar everywhere, is when you're going to pursue a sponsored award, you go through an internal process, and it's the central office that actually submits your response, your proposal to the agency. And anyone who's gone through that grant process probably has horror stories or a little bit of PTSD from you're going through all these really rigid bureaucratic systems. And gosh, I remember applying for grants with NSF and so on, these really horrible web platforms, and you're just terrified of being blindsided by this button won't click, right? You're already so stressed from just getting the contents of the proposal all lined up and satisfying all the requirements and just perfect. And then these systems are really clunky and cumbersome. And so anytime you change the process on folks going through that, you're setting yourself up to sort of play a little bit of counselor and maybe therapist to help walk people back from the ledge when something changes and doesn't go as they expected. So we updated our process with Office of Research that anything working with regulated data needed to be inside of these AWS environments that were ecosystems that were being built by our central IT, our engineering teams, and then the faculty would be onboarded into those environments and to whatever extent was necessary.
Did you get any pushback from the campus or the researchers about kind of, at some level you're imposing some kind of structure to this and process, and I'm just curious in terms of whether there was any pushback or what those discussions were like to kind of bring people along to, obviously you have to comply with the rules, but was there any, or how did that go?
So I think we were careful, but we were also maybe lucky in hindsight. We did the right things without necessarily knowing why to do them or all the details of how it would pan out. But we had engaged early on in conversations with the faculty senate and with select deans across the university to really get their feedback. And so we had already created some materials, websites and FAQs and things of that nature that really did proactively address the concerns that faculty would have. Example, one of the reoccurring things is I have to be able to collaborate with people at other institutions, and so we were able to put in the FAQ, you will be able to collaborate with anyone. All those fears, and so we did a good job of proactively addressing those before the formal process change. But there was that fear. There was a lot of fear associated with it, and we knew what we needed to deliver on, back to the rapid turnaround time for cost forecasts to help faculty write direct costs into their grant. That was really important because we knew that when this process went into effect, there's a timer, a fuse on all of these proposals when they go through our sponsored award process, where we couldn't become a bottleneck to help them put those costs into their grant at the last moment, knowing that there's a deadline looming for them that's oftentimes very short turnaround. So we had addressed a lot of those concerns. We also knew from those conversations what value metrics, if you want to use the term, we had to hit, right? How we needed to deliver the service to be satisfactory or well received by the community. And it ultimately culminated in a memo from our provost, sort of co-issued by our VP of Research and our CIO, saying, this is the a requirement for these sponsored awards. But yeah, there was a lot of fear, and when that process changed and we had done our best to proactively communicate, but it's very difficult to reach all the nooks and crannies of an institution. And so there were still folks who were blindsided, and they submit their proposal, oftentimes, very close to the deadline, the internal deadline, which is in advance of the external deadline. And then they would be redirected to me and then the team, saying you need to account for this regulated data environment, and this team has to sign off saying yes, we can comply with these requirements of the grant. And so for those first few weeks to month or so, it was really sort of really hands-on, making sure we were extremely responsive to those inquiries. And so that's where we had same day turnaround or I mean, half-hour turnaround time. Many people's needs were actually very simple. Some of them were more difficult. I don't want to say that there weren't some edge cases that were difficult to address or put the cost parameters around, but that's why we have the team here to support that.
That's an interesting point. How, going back to my earlier point about a lot of places choose to, create a VDI environment, and you can just have a desktop and, essentially, that how complicated is it for you to have, basically provide people, an environment that they need and, that their research demands or whatever they, is that a problem for you, or is that, it doesn't sound like it takes you too much energy.
No.
I mean, obviously you said a lot of people have simple requests, but let's say there's going to be some percentage that are going to have something a little more complicated. Is that really that? Is it a challenge, or is it not that big of a deal, or how would you characterize that?
Yeah, it wasn't a big challenge. Oftentimes, with our faculty, it spans the whole gamut from faculty who really do just need a simple VDI environment to folks who have slightly more complicated needs to folks who are effectively running their own high performance clusters in their own data centers or in a central data center. And so oftentimes the more complex the requirements are, the more you really just deliver the envelope and train and onboard and let them build up the internal details of it, and you're there to help them crosswalk their knowledge of computing systems to the AWS environment. So it's not as hard as it might seem initially. We also had developed some very simple sort of prototype environments. And the nice thing about being out in the cloud is infrastructure is code. So our processes in deploying all of this and securing everything initially was a manual process with an Excel type checklist, and then you slowly automate it to where you hit a tipping point where now you don't start with a manual process, you start with an automated process that might output a checklist of a handful of manual checks or controls to implement. So realistically, for all of WSU and all of our sponsored award regulated data research going on, it's probably about a quarter of an FTE full-time equivalent, so a quarter of a position necessary to do all of the initial intake and builds and costing turnarounds. And it's probably only an eighth of an FTE, give or take, to maintain it, right? To maintain it all, having leveraged and gone through the learning curve of that automation, right? You wouldn't necessarily start there, it'd be a little bit more work up front, but these aren't huge time commitments in general. So no, it's actually, we're able to turn that around very quickly for that reason.
And as doing it in the cloud, I'm gonna guess is part of the reason it's that it's repeatable, that it's understandable, it's observable, is part of the reason that you can keep those FTE commitments down to that level.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you think about this holistically, where we know we're fundamentally complying with security requirements, and we are going to be audited on every one of these environments at one point or another. And so we start with what are the faculty needs. We do that initial consult. In the ideal scenario, where the faculty haven't been blindsided by, their award suddenly being redirected to us, we start with what are your needs. We do a quick crosswalk of that to one of our templates for the design. We say, okay, this is what we're going to build. This is what it'll cost you. It's all very well known. They can actually attach that right to their grant proposal, those letters of support and so on. And then when it comes time to build it, the code's all automated to deploy it. And when it's time for it to be audited, we have that documentation, the provisioning process generates all the artifacts we know an auditor is going to ask for at some point. And so it's all, very well streamlined from that perspective, because we know what the ultimate deliverable is going to be, which is passing that audit and getting the researchers into an environment that they're comfortable with, whatever type of research they might have. So
how do you guys, what is the breakdown of how something like this is, even if it's an eighth of an FTE, right? Somebody's spending that money, somebody's choosing to pay for this. I mean, is this something where if, the university wants to support regulated or, compliance encumbered research, whatever term you want to use, is this something where the university is covering part of these costs, or is it something the grants have to cover, or how are you paying for all this? Let's just put it that way.
So great question. So those FTE that I mentioned, those fractional portions of an employee, those are covered centrally by the institution. And the direct costs for the grant, so the costs actually incurred by the research being done, the servers being run, the virtual desktops and so on, those are being funded by the grant. So those direct costs are written on the grant. Those overhead costs are covered by the institution. We could have a whole conversation about F&A and indirects and how those are used within an institution, get oversubscribed 12 different ways. But I would say in my personal opinion, allocating half an FTE centrally funded by grant indirects is a great way to spend those indirects to ensure continuity of research, which is fundamentally for what it was. The conversation very much at WC wasn't should we do something, it was what must we do, because we were seeing, even in surprising ways from surprising quarters, research potentially getting shut off because of these security requirements. And there's obviously ones where it's a DoD CUI sub-award, the ones you would think about in terms of regulated data, that's there, but you're expecting that, so it's a little bit easier to manage when you know it's coming. What was more surprising was just the simple data sharing agreements that we have with agencies like the CDC or the Department of Licensing and so on, suddenly having new requirements with real teeth behind them. And all of a sudden, faculty who had never had to think about regulated data and security before being blindsided, and these agencies are telling them, sorry, we won't give you this data to complete your funded research until you can comply with this. And so we were slowly getting squeezed, and we had that pressure release valve of this informal process, but we really needed to standardize it. For us, it was a matter of investing so that we could guarantee into the future the ability to do the research we've always done.
Right. So just one thought came into my mind about the cost element of this. You mentioned deploying kind of an envelope that the researchers can work within. Is that envelope, say, like all the logging and stuff that needs to be done for auditing and storing those logs and all of that? Is that something you do and the researchers don't need to worry about? Or is that something, it's like, okay, here's your thing and we're going to give you all the controls and it's now your problem? Or is that something that you maintain and they don't have to worry about that stuff?
Right. So great question. Yeah, absolutely. So we maintain all of that. We provide them an environment that's compliant, and we know what's, in maybe 90% of the situations, we even build out everything the researcher needs. It's only when a researcher really is on that leading edge, and maybe the technology is part of the research itself, where we sort of say, okay, we've built what we can, and now it's up to you. And those are the researchers who are happy to take it the last mile, because that's what their research is. They have those competencies in their teams. So that whole envelope of logging and security and permissions and continuous assessments, those are all done centrally, and we have now an automated process that does those continual real-time assessments. So if something does change in the environment, we receive proactive notifications. You're actually very proud of that system. It sends direct instructions to everybody, whoever the direct manager of the environment is, tells them what was seen, what the instructions are to fix it. It's a great little bit of automation, and that's again a testament to the API under AWS being so robust that you can automate that over time. We didn't start there, but we got there, just by slow iterative improvements.
Speaking to that, about how long is this whole journey? And I know it was happening organically, I would say. Correct me if that's not what it was, but you started out with this specific kind of case and that you described at the beginning, and it's evolved over time. I mean, what is the time period that you're talking about here?
Yeah, so we've been, I would describe the watershed was when the memo came out of the provost's office saying, thou shalt, right? Thou shalt use this program. And when the process from Office of Research Responsive Awards directed, hairpinned through my team for providing these environments and the cost estimates and support. And that's been about 1.5 years now since that memo came out. Prior to that pressure release valve startup phase, soft launch phase was probably about a year or so, a year and a half maybe, of helping the institution informally comply with these security requirements and audits and so on out in AWS. So that's been the rough timeline.
Right. So in university time, 2.5 years is pretty fast, I would say, having also worked in universities for a long time.
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So fairly quickly. I mean, again, we knew it had to happen, so there was no lack of willpower to solve the problem. It just was, how can we solve it in a way that actually meets the needs? And that was that was where the effort was put.
How, related to that time period, on the scale of the way universities make decisions and do things, it's reasonably fast. But on the scale of teams coming up to speed with new ways of doing things, and now I'm talking more from the technical perspective, you personally and your team, what was your cloud and AWS, skill level before all of this? Were you doing things in the cloud already, and you guys and ladies had ability there, or has there been kind of a learning and doing process? Did you have any outside help with any of this? I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, so another great question. So we had a little bit of experience in the cloud and with AWS in particular with virtual desktop solutions, initially with AWS workspaces for our student labs, and then when AWS AppStream 2 came out with support for higher ed just after COVID started, with the full desktop experience, switching from workspaces to AppStream for VDI solutions for computer labs to support our students across the state. And a little bit of usage of AWS as a backup target for our on-prem data, S3 for those big object store buckets, and then a little bit of maybe containerized web applications. So it wasn't a lot of experience. We weren't really we weren't spending 90% of our time out in AWS on a typical day, right? It was maybe 10%. So we didn't have a tremendous amount of background in AWS, just general technology background. In my personal opinion, the best way to train and learn on something is to actually do it. So for me, it was a real simple decision just to allocate some money out of our unit budget, about $5,000 initially, to just say, this is money we're going to spend on AWS just to build things and tear them down and interrogate them with the API and see how AWS really works under the hood, and go out and make some expensive mistakes potentially. I say expensive, it's all relative, right? There's for the most part, it's hard to go too far wrong with on-demand pricing. You spin up a server that's expensive, well, you get charged for a few minutes of it before you turn it off, right? So there's all the controls out there, but I knew my team was gonna build something wrong, need to tear it down and build it again, right? So that's just part of a learning curve. And so that $5,000 that first year is probably the best training money I've ever spent, getting people hands-on with the technology to learn it. So that was really critical, was getting people into an environment where they could actually learn the thing. All the training that happened afterwards, people attending training sessions, and we even coordinated an on-prem, on-campus training, AWS-led training, instructor-led training on-prem. That was all helpful, but what was really important was that they actually had a real environment that was persistent to build in. So that was the big piece of it. And because we were starting with, here's a very specific use case and a very specific need that needs to be satisfied, it's not like you have to go out and learn all of AWS. You need to learn some permissions and some networking, and then a little bit of typically workspaces, whatever that VDI tool you're using is. And you don't have to learn about the relational databases and FSX and the TLA soup, the 3-letter acronym soup of services that exists out in the cloud. You don't have to be an expert on 180 different services or whatever the service count is now. You really just need to be good enough at 4 or 5 to satisfy the majority of your use cases, and you will grow from there, right?
You don't have to boil the ocean with AWS. You can try to focus on the areas that are relevant to what problem you're trying to solve. And
Right.
I'm wondering how much you engaged with AWS during this process, whether you're the account team that you had or any other, stuff that's just online, or you said you did some instructor-led training. I mean, was that helpful, or did that play a factor in how you proceeded here?
So I think a lot of that training, especially the on-prem training, was very helpful so much from a technical learning perspective, but from overcoming what I would say that institutional lethargy that's inherent in changing how you do business, whether it's technology business or finance business or anything else. It was starting to chip away and create some cracks in that shield that the institution puts up to protect its way of doing business, in that flow of information in. And so our account team was excellent to work with in terms of facilitating that flow of information and so on. But those initial environments, I would say we didn't really leverage the account team specifically or the technical support from AWS in building them. We just went out and built a couple prototypes on our own and made mistakes and fixed them. And then when we were ready to go live, we went live with our first problem, and we were nervous, but we passed the audit, with flying colors, and there you go. And then the rest is history. So we're getting that first thing in place to then iterate over was the most important thing we could do for learning the environment and training.
And what would you say, now that this is, bumping along, what has been the reaction from the leadership and the folks that care, that are responsible for compliance, the CISO, the compliance people, and the faculty themselves?
So yeah, absolutely. So a lot of different stakeholders within the institution. So I meet at a minimum every other week with our security team here at WSU that's in charge of compliance and policies and so on. So worked very closely with them to make sure that they were happy and comfortable with everything we were doing. Anytime you're doing something fundamentally new from a security or a compliance or a policy perspective, you're creating a lot of work for people to go out and adjust policies and so on, and respond to new types of audits and learning curves. So we approach them very much as a customer of ours, of how can we help them overcome the challenges that they're going to face in performing their role of compliance and policy writing for these environments. So they were one of our customers and worked very well, right? They're very happy with these environments. So we have a great relationship. In terms of our faculty, it was sort of funny. I was in preparation for this webinar, I reached out to our Associate VP of Research, Dan Nordquist here, and I said, well, in your perspective, no reason, how has this program gone since we launched it? And not knowing why I was asking or what this webinar was going on, he said, well, I think it's going great. And the data that I have to support that is, since we went live, I have not had a single researcher reach out to me with a complaint. So that's about the gold star you get. You don't necessarily get a lot of attaboys, when things work well, just under the hood on the IT perspective. But when you get 0 complaints over a 1.5 year period of fundamentally changing, adding a step to how research happens, I mean, that's a pretty good success outcome. And the last thing that I'm probably most proud of, part of supporting this is we have weekly cloud office hours for anyone at the institution, faculty, staff, students, even, to come in and learn about the cloud. And we've had many faculty who started with having to use AWS because of this regulated data environment requirement, to going, I like it, can you help me use it more? And helping them expand it to their research programs for non-regulated data, but also for their instructional workloads. We now have faculty in several of our colleges who are doing their regulated data research out in AWS, but they're also, one of my favorite programs is we use AppStream to provide VDI environments, virtual desktop infrastructure environments, for students across the state. But then within that same envelope, there's all these Linux bioinformatics servers running that they can jump from their AppStream instance to those bioinformatics workloads and get hands-on real work with bioinformatics workloads, right? Undergraduate and graduate. So seeing faculty start off a little bit nervous, or maybe sweating a little bit when they show up for their consult, going, okay, what is this going to cost me, and so on, to going, how can I use this everywhere else because it's great? That's another thing. So really haven't had any negative feedback so far, which is rare. I'm still waiting. It's almost like waiting for the shoe to drop, right? When is someone gonna struggle? But no, it's been really great.
What would you say? I mean, obviously there's been tons of lessons learned here. I mean, it's been sounds like it's been a learning process the whole way. But in terms of maybe lessons learned that were surprising, things that came up to you that were interesting and maybe ultimately more important than you thought they were at the time?
Yeah, so lessons learned, a lot of the challenges we did face stemmed from one of two things. Either the avenue or level of communication that we went through to communicate with faculty proactively and minimize the number of folks who were blindsided a little bit, but also the extent to which we went and coordinated with the financial portion of the university on operationalizing all the workflows around this. Those are the two big things, I think of in terms of those lessons learned. I think we knew going into it that we knew we were going to have to deliver on rapid turnaround times for price consults and designing environments and those sorts of things, and that there was going to be a lot of really stressed out faculty being redirected from the Office of Research in those first few weeks and month. And so we were prepared for that. What we weren't prepared for necessarily was the extent to which we would have to aggressively communicate and re-communicate through all the different communication channels of the university to catch everybody, bring people up to speed, and then the level of coordination needed with all the distributed finance teams to make sure that all the money just flowed and the billing happened just the right way. So those are the two big things, at least from a non-technical perspective. Yeah, I'm trying to think here. Did I miss anything?
Well, one thing that popped into my head that I get asked all the time is just in general about using the cloud is kind of surprises, particularly around people spending. Are there things that you do to help both in the secure environments and in non-regulated cloud usage by research, to help them kind of avoid surprises?
Right. Yeah, one of the first things I learned how to do in AWS after I created my first account was to set billing alarms on the account. So I'd get an email if my spending was different than what it should be. And so one of the things that we did, and this goes back to getting something initially in place and then iterating over it, was how can we do two things? How can we prevent big risks with big negative outcomes from happening in the first place? And then how can we mitigate little risks and make sure they stay little, right? And it goes back to that spending piece of it. And that's probably one of the big concerns I hear from folks is, how do I manage the spend? And especially from our finance folks, of what do you mean I don't know what it's going to cost every month, right? And you have to do all this Excel, you have to, these spreadsheets to forecast how much it'll cost and cost drivers and so on. So that's a very different model for folks to live in, to let them know. Oh yeah.
When you say big things as opposed to small things, I mean, you and I have talked other times, and you had a great example of like setting controls on accounts, like you just couldn't do this thing that could really be a big problem. Could you share that story again, or that?
Oh, absolutely. So what we do, the basic environment we have, we use AWS organizations as our container for AWS accounts, and we have little folders for the accounts that they go into with policies applied to them. And from a financial perspective, one of the main uses of those policies is to prevent those big financial spends from happening without warning, right? The AWS console does a really good job of warning you when you're going to spend a lot of money, but a little bit of extra control helps. So a good example is AWS Macy is used to profile data in your S3 buckets, looking for private data, personally identifiable information, social security numbers, things like that. Wonderful tool. I use it all the time, but it is one of those potentially scary, big, expensive buttons to turn on when you have a large amount of data. And so if you have an S3 bucket and you want to profile the data, we have environments where if someone goes and turns on the data profiling, it'll be maybe $80,000 to profile all the data, because they have 100 terabytes or more of data in there, and it's a private bucket and we know what data is in it and we don't need to profile it. So we just use those policies on the accounts to make it so you can't push that button. No one can push the button. If you need to push the button, you want to spend that money, you actually have to send us a ticket or come to office hours, and we'll temporarily remove the policy in your account, let the button be pressed, and then put it back on, right? And we have a sort of a short list of those things that we have those controls on, because we want people to be able to go in and feel confident they can click on just about anything and not get a big surprise at the end of the month, right?
Great, thank you. So we're coming up towards the end here, and I just wanted to ask you, kind of as a final question, you know, what if your peers out in the world who are, you know, thinking of evolving or doing this kind of thing for the first time, you know, what are some key recommendations that you would give them, just from your experience, that would be valuable for them to know?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is don't wait too long, right? It's really easy to keep deferring the problem and waiting to just start solving it. I think folks really let perfect get in the way of good. They want to solve every problem with regulated data, or they want to solve every problem related to the cloud, but start with a very simple need, a very simple use case, solve that, and then iterate over it, right? You're going to need to go back and do some rework over time. There's no way to avoid that. If I had sat down 3 years ago and said, how can I plan out everything to get to the state I am today? There's no way I could. There's no number of consultants I could have hired or trainings I could have gone to that would have really prepared me to make all those decisions to get where we are today. You just have to start implementing and iterating.
The use case is key. I mean, I'm always telling people, you know, if you build it, they will come model almost never works. You really need, you know, at least one, better if you have a few use cases to work off of and to drive
Right.
your decision making. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. You have to have a real problem to solve. Otherwise, what are you doing, right? So you need to take a real need, an unmet need or an undermet need at the institution, and solve it, right? That's really important.
Would you go further than that? You know, you started out in a very specific area that has very specific needs, like an actual problem, you know, not just like, oh, I have to, I have CUI or CMMC or HIPAA or whatever, and I'm going to solve for that.
Right.
But to actually have a use case that requires that compliance. Do you think that that's also good?
I think that's also good, absolutely, because you talk about NIST 800-171 or CMMC. Well, what does it mean? You're in AWS, you're providing an ecosystem. You're not providing a specific technical service. So the actual specific controls may vary depending on the actual need. If there's no need for, say, public access to any part of it, that's one sort of template that you deploy. If there is a need for public access, that's another. And they have very different control and compliance requirements. And you can't sit down in a vacuum and brainstorm every workflow and need that your researchers are going to have. So starting with a known need, solving it, and then iterating and expanding is critical.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank you today. I'm going to hand this back over to Jack to see if we have a few questions or one or two questions before the top of the hour. Jack, do you have a question or two for Bill, or maybe I?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Scott, for an excellent presentation and discussion there. A reminder to folks on the webinar today to feel free to enter questions into the GoToWebinar tool on the right side of your screen. We do have one question. So the question is, what's next for your environment? And what new compliance requirements or research workloads or data do you foresee affecting your environment?
Yeah, so I think really what's next is the same thing that's on many people's horizons, which is looking at the finalization of the CMMC specification, the version 2 of it, because that's when a lot of our requirements are really going to be mandated or required on a large portion of our research here at WSU. So that's certainly on the horizon. We're watching that to make sure that we're ahead of wherever that specification lands and its requirements. Really what's next for us is taking the successes we have here working with the regulated data and, like I said, slowly expanding it out to the other areas of work, instruction and outreach being done here at WSU. to complement what our faculty are doing in all facets of their work, whether it's research or instruction and so on. Really growing that piece of it is really what's on the horizon for us, I think, most. And then as far as new needs, you know, here at WC, we really have compartmentalized the regulated data program and high performance computing program. And I see the need in the future to start marrying those together over time and having a standardized way of doing high performance computing workloads out in these regulated data environments in a strategic way that's cost effective. We're seeing that need a little bit coming from our physics department, but I expect that to expand over the next 5 to 10 years in particular.
Great. Anything else, Jack?
Question. Have you seen varying compliance requirements on grants from different agencies, particularly related to continuous monitoring and reporting?
Yes, I mean, almost every data sharing agreement we sign has some clause in there around continuous monitoring and reporting. And so that is the process I mentioned earlier that continuously measures the state, the configuration of the AWS account and the resources inside of it, and generates alerts and alarms when we deviate from our described state to the auditors. Specifically, we're using a number of tools, AWS Config, Security Hub, Guard Duty, and so on. Those all roll up, IAM Analyzer, all those alerts roll up into findings, and then we have an automated process on top of that processes those findings and generates those alerts and notifications and so on. So that's, again, using all of those native security tools in AWS to do that heavy lifting for us, and then we just have to sort of have the process that tells those findings where to go and with the right information to get followed up on.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions here. If anyone does have any questions who's on the line here, feel free to put them in. But in the absence of that, I want to thank both Bill and Scott again for an excellent presentation today. Really insightful discussion. So for those who tuned in, you can find information about upcoming sessions as well as recordings and presentation decks on our series homepage at the link that should have just popped up on your screen. And if you have any questions about past presentations or ideas for future presentations, please email us at aws-wwps-seminar@amazon.com. And then for our next webinar session, that will be titled Deep Data Needs and Challenges in Precision Medicine, and will take place on May 25th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. The webinar will focus on how Stanford University is handling large-scale medical studies in the cloud and how you can too. Thank you again to the presenters here, and if there's anything else, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I bid you a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yep. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jack.